MAME phase.
Video time. Why a video today? Well, Peter Wilhelmsen has dumped a very rare game for the Gamate handheld system. The Gamate was a 1991 handheld system from Bit Corporation, and the last known but undumped game for it is a game called Mighty Boxer, and that has now been dumped. He's been searching for the game for many years, and one finally showed up, so he had it sent to him, and he used some tools that he developed with Morton Kirkgard back in the day to dump the other Gamate games, and finally we have a dump of the game Mighty Boxer, and it runs, as you'd expect in MAME, perfectly well. However, I thought I'd also use this opportunity to have a look at a load of other boxing games in MAME, for the home systems, for the arcade systems, for the plug and plays, because there are so many of them, and it's interesting to see how different companies took different approaches to boxing before we start to look at the actual Gamate game, the main feature here. Now, many of these you may not have seen before, many you will have seen before. There's going to be famous games, there's going to be games you've never heard of, especially the likes of the plug and play ones where, you might have a boxing game amongst 100 other games. Some of those are better than others, some of them surprise me, some of them are just not worth the time of day at all. But anyway, if you just want to see the Gamate Mighty Boxer coverage, then I'll put a timestamp in the video below to skip to that. But otherwise, here is a selection of boxing games in MAME, some of which, might be worth checking out. Yu Suzuki, one of the most famous names at Sega and the driving force behind the superscalar titles such as Outrun, got his first break at Sega by creating a boxing game, Champion Boxing, for the SG-1000 computer. This would also appear in the arcades on a board powered by the very same technology as the home system. Champion Boxer wasn't Sega's first attempt at creating a boxing game, however. That honour would go to Heavyweight Champ. The original Heavyweight Champ from 1976 is however not yet emulated, but Sega would reuse the title for an innovative 1987 boxing game where the player would swivel the entire top half of the cabinet, including the monitor, as part of the control scheme. In the early 1990s, Sega would again use the name Heavyweight Champ for a game, this time with versions on both the Game Gear and Master System. The Master System version of this goes by a couple of different names due to licensing deals, but the Game Gear release, shown here, was only ever released under the title Heavyweight Champ. While you could maybe consider it an arcade port, it really has little in common with the arcade games of the same name. Nintendo would also have a rather famous line of boxing titles, starting in the arcades with Punch-Out! In 1984. Like many well-known Nintendo products, this boxing game would be presented in dual screen format, with a stacked top and bottom monitor arrangement. Boxing would also reach consumer hands in portable form in 1984 with Nintendo's Micro Versus system, a spin-off from the Game & Watch line of devices. The initial releases of this were simply branded Boxing, but later rebranded as Punch-Out! Due to the popularity of the arcade game. As MAME emulates far more than just arcades these days, both versions can be experienced within it. Boxing was naturally a sport which would spawn a number of celebrity figures, and getting Mike Tyson to sign on the dotted line was a big deal for Nintendo and would see his likeness appear in the Nintendo Entertainment System release of Punch-Out! MAME offers you two ways to run this one. You can either play the NES original, or you can run the Play Choice 10 version, although that is still just the NES version with an external timer limiting your playtime. Boxing would have an influence on media even outside of gaming, and Ashita no Joe is an example of what started off as a Japanese manga series proving popular enough to have games developed around it. The lesser known arcade title to be based off this is a game put out by Taito and Wave in 1990. It even got a release outside of Japan as Success Joe. A year later would see maybe one of the most infamous boxing-themed games, Legend of Success Joe, for SNK's Neo Geo platform. While maybe not initially obvious that it's meant to be a boxing game rather than a belt-scrolling brawler, the game is still at its core a boxing title, with in-ring segments between the street scenes. It's not a great game by any means, but I think people trying to rank it in genres it does not belong hasn't helped its cause over the years. I looked at Nintendo's Micro Versus System boxing earlier, but it wasn't the first time an electronic boxing game would be created. Earlier examples can be found. Head-to-Head Electronic Boxing from Coleco is an example of a 1982 handheld representation of the sport. The presentation here uses even more primitive-looking technology, with boxers being represented using arrangements of simple red segments. Towards the end of the 80s, Taito released their own boxing game to the arcades, Final Blow. While the arcade original isn't especially noteworthy and rarely gets talked about in its own right, it has a more interesting story, one we'll come to shortly, when it comes to one of the ports. The game itself, large sprites, but very mechanical feeling animation and movement. When it came to home releases, Sega would be another to attach a celebrity license to one of their console ports. Western Genesis and Mega Drive releases of Final Blow were named after James "Buster" Douglas, who had briefly held the heavyweight title after defeating Mike Tyson. While now more of a historical curiosity, MAME makes it easy to look at this version of the game, or even the Japanese Mega Drive release without the licensed content, and compare them to the arcade original. I suppose now is a good time to look at some of the lesser known arcade titles too. SNK's Main Event, not to be confused with Konami's wrestling title The Main Event, is a 1984 boxing game with rather confusing dual joystick and button controls. Interestingly, this one fails its ROM check in MAME, which is sometimes a sign of a bad dump and at other times can be a sign of a prototype or at least a game that was rushed to market with little care or attention. Ring King is Data East's attempt at a boxing title, or rather Woodplace's attempt at a boxing title, as Data East simply licensed the Woodplace game King of Boxer and put their name on it. This one is surprisingly well remembered, and despite not being the first game to come to mind, has a good following.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Versus TKO Boxing is a game running on Nintendo's Versus System hardware, basically NES hardware in the arcades. Credited to Data East and Namco, it's basically just the home port of the aforementioned Ring King brought back to the arcades with a new title on weaker hardware. The Final Round, or Hard Puncher as it's known in Japan, is a Konami game, one that's largely forgotten. Outside of ER Kung Fu, Konami wasn't really known for one-on-one fighting titles, but the Final Round does manage to offer a little more depth than many arcade boxing titles, giving you the chance to adjust your character build before you fight.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Plug-and-play games were often advertised as fitness devices, and boxing-themed games were chosen as an activity in many cases. Radica's Play TV Boxing was a dedicated unit and included a number of different modes including sparring and hitting given targets. While this one appears to use motion controls, the gloves just seem to send back digital signals to the main unit depending on your actions, so it is playable in MAME even without the motion controls being emulated. Japan had its fair share of plug-and-plays too, and a number of those were either based on boxing or had boxing mechanics. Unfortunately, the controller hookups are significantly more complex on many of the Japanese developed units, and Epoch's Excite Boxing is no exception. While you can tell it's a well-produced and polished product, you can currently only observe the attract mode. Once we end up in the territory of Wii knockoff consoles, things start to get a little ropier. The Zone 100 is one of a number of such devices, and the boxing game found on this generation of systems sees you take on bland, pre-rendered, baby-faced opponents. The family sport consoles, of which the Millennium M521 Arcade Neo 2.0 is one, have a different evolution of this boxing game. Again, you're facing the same characters, but this time the view is slightly further zoomed out. The rather anonymously named Interactive TV Games 49 in 1 is another to feature a boxing game, but this time with a very flat shaded style of graphical work. It does feel like more effort was put into this one though.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Another one that doesn't yet have working inputs is the TV Fitness Center from Lexibook, which again contains a unique boxing game. The Millennium Arcade 250 is running a different line of software compared to the previously mentioned Millennium M521, and as such has its own boxing game. Scraping the barrel somewhat is the Zing wireless interactive TV game Wii TV Zone 48 in 1, which is the only one in this video to be running on VT1682 based technology. VT1682 was one of those bootleg evolutions of NES technology, but where the NES compatibility was dropped entirely, offering only the newer video and audio systems. Most of the games produced for said hardware were exceptionally bad, and this is no exception. Scenario's My Sports Challenge also features a unique boxing game, although the setting for it is more a street fight than a boxing match. There are a number of others that call themselves boxing games but are variants of kickboxing instead, so I haven't included those. I've covered a lot of the 8-bit UK micros on my videos and live streams over the years, and of course they had boxing games too. And again here we have a celebrity license, this time Frank Bruno, and it would be budget label Elite bringing us a Punch-Out knockoff on the UK home systems. It's generally not considered to be very good, and it's an annoying tape multiloader, but again it shows the wide-reaching influence of both professional sport and other games in the genre. There were even lower budget games on the ZX Spectrum too, and By Fair Means or Foul is one of them. The likeness to a certain blonde, scruffy, serial foul-playing UK politician on the loading screen is uncanny, even if it was released long before his time. The game did get reissued by Codemasters as Pro Boxing Simulator, but it's really nothing to write home about. A much better boxing game was released for the Amstrad CPC. It did also have releases on other 8-bit platforms, but the CPC version is my preference here. This time, bringing Barry McGuigan on board, the title adds a lot more depth with an entire career mode. I'm not even a big fan of the sport, but I spent many hours with this one back in the day, and it's one of my fondest memories of the system. Sticking with the CPC, 3D Boxing was one of the first party-labelled Amsoft releases for the CPC, and while none were developed by Amstrad directly, the branding did carry some weight. This one is noteworthy, mainly for being one of a handful of games that could use the SSA-1 speech unit to provide some additional speech synthesis to the game. It's also one of many games at the time to claim to be 3D, with very little to merit that claim. There are older boxing games for home systems too, and I do like to pull obscure games out of the hat on this channel, so I'll mention that the Interton Electronic VC4000 had a boxing game, simply called Boxing Match. Like many late 70s games, this is a 2-player only game, so you'll need a friend to play it with. While MAME's VC4000 driver is really quite awful and should not really be marked as working, it probably hasn't been touched since 2001 and has its own local implementation of the video chip rather than using the core. This game does appear to be mostly functional, with a bit of flickering which may happen on the real system. The Dragon 32, a Welsh Coco clone, has quite a bad reputation. Games like World Boxing, a 1986 release from DB Software, likely contribute to that. The title screen makes a bold statement, probably the best boxing game for the Dragon 32, and by virtue of, I believe, being the only boxing game on the Dragon 32, it isn't wrong. The game, however, is incredibly slow, has terrible unresponsive controls, and it looks more like you're trying to fit pieces of plumbing together than hold a boxing match. It also crashes when starting a game if you're brave enough to use a non-standard character such as an exclamation mark in your boxer's name. Oh dear. The Gamate itself was a competitor to the original Game Boy, so it would make sense to show an example of a boxing game for the original Game Boy too. Heavyweight Championship Boxing is one such example, and the gameplay mixes it up a little bit. You've got a scene where you're moving around the ring, and then a punch-out section when you get close to your opponent. Another example of a handheld boxing game, but on a newer platform, would be Wade Hickston's Counterpunch on the Game Boy Advance. It's a good looking game, with very cartoony graphics, and follows the punch-out formula that proved so popular, especially on the Nintendo platforms. Another newer game is Ready to Rumble Boxing on the PlayStation. This 1999 release, which was also hugely popular on the Dreamcast, is maybe surprising in that it never got an arcade release. It was strictly a home platform game. Like so many of the games featured here, the tone isn't overly serious, with each boxer having a great deal of personality. Not every boxing game in MAME has fared so well over the years, however. In fact, it seems a genre where many games are less than perfect. Jellicoe's Best Bout Boxing is a minor offender, with some unwanted tarmac wraparound during various parts of the presentation. It doesn't affect the gameplay though, and while no means a classic, it has flair and a pace about it that makes it really work as an arcade game. Taito's Primetime Fighter, also known as Top Ranking Stars, has a regression with the rendering of the attract sequence, although playability does seem unaffected. The game runs on Taito's F3 board, and the video system for F3 is incredibly complex, and while many F3 based games in MAME have seen recent improvements, this one has not. It's interesting how many of the F3 video issues show up in unexpected places, situations you wouldn't expect to be pushing the hardware too heavily, and situations where it doesn't really look like the games are trying to do anything too fancy. Kaneko's vs Gong fight still has unemulated protection, causing some colour issues in the game, although the Taito licensed clones Ring Fighter do work fine. The zoomed out viewpoint here is similar to the previously shown Ring King from Data East, although in this case the camera is pulled out even further, meaning sprites are much smaller. The control scheme is also more basic here, as while you can move around the ring freely, there are only left and right attacks, making it far less memorable than the Data East title. In all honesty, there's not much noteworthy about this one, which is probably why nobody has studied the protection in the parent set to the extent needed to fix it. IREM's Pound for Pound suffers from a long-standing regression in MAME, leaving it basically unplayable, as when a bug was fixed to allow inputs to work in the selection menus, it appears to have almost entirely broken the controls in actual gameplay. The game takes an unusual top-down viewpoint and uses a trackball for movement. When working properly, it's a fast-paced game where you can zip around the ring rather quickly and precisely to land your blows. Sega's Title Fight is more of an embarrassing regression to still have around, with the backgrounds in the game being entirely broken since the System 32 hardware rewrite many years back. Much like Taito's F3 system, the System 32 hardware is a complex beast, and the variant, Multi-32, a version of the board designed to power 2 monitors, is no exception. I think the video problems here are related to some of the problems that can also be seen in Jurassic Park with the headlight effects later on, and possibly even the Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder transition effects that are currently missing. Fixing them may require another substantial rewrite of the emulation code. Another Sega game, Funky Head Boxers, which runs on the STV Sega Titan video hardware platform, a version of the Saturn, suffers from some quite bad sprite dropout and corruption at times, although probably isn't one you're going to want to play anyway, because it feels like what would happen if you combined Balls 3D with a boxing game, but without any of the more redeeming parts of Balls 3D. To finish off this look at other boxing games in MAME, here's one I'd like to get working personally, Zavix Sport Boxing. It runs on Super Zavix hardware, which unfortunately means it does not currently get past the boot screen. So, there we go. Not a comprehensive list by any means, but a fair selection of the boxing games you can run in MAME today. Some were good, some were bad, some were well emulated, some really weren't very well emulated at all, and some definitely need a lot of work before they're even playable. Now though, we're going to have a look at the main feature. We're going to have a look at Mighty Boxer for the Gamate. That was what you see when you first put the Mighty Boxer cartridge into your Gamate and turn it on. But what about the parts you see even before that? When Peter Wilhelmsen purchased Mighty Boxer, the product that he received was complete in box, and he was kind enough to take photos of each part. First, you've got the front cover, which is the source of the background image I've been using for this video. It does a good job of conveying what the game is, and has a number of what appear to be pricing stickers, suggesting this was at least for sale at retail at one point in the past. The back cover, with some almost passable English flavour text discussing the masculine boxing contest that awaits you, also happens to give us a 1992 date for this one, so a year after the console launched. The in-game copyright showed 1991, but it wasn't uncommon for software to have been completed earlier, with a release schedule dictating when it hit the market. The 1992 date might also explain the scarcity of this one, because 1992 was the same year Bit Corporation closed its doors, with later Gamate releases being handled by UNC and Funtech, makers of the Super Acan, so this could have been one of those that barely made it out the door during that transitional period. Moving on to the cartridge itself, or game card if you prefer that term, you have the same image, this time though showing a 1991 date, but as discussed it's possible the product was already complete and the cartridge is manufactured at that point. A quick view of everything. You can see the plastic holders the media came in, which suggests this may have not been used much back in the day, or at least it was well looked after. The fold-out manual was also in excellent condition, the front of it can be seen here, and that little picture of two Gamates in the bottom left corner is actually important. Going through the manual, you have the table of content in Chinese, as you'd expect. The next pages seem to show some basic system operation instructions, and the following pages show what are maybe some of the game operating instructions. There are then pages detailing the boxes available to you, 2 boxes per page, so this double page spread gives you 4 of the boxes you can choose from. The next pages show the remaining 2 boxes and presumably a bit about the gameplay, as the screen shown there is the one that you get when you lose a fight. Then we have a bit more about the gameplay, and from the English text we can deduce this is talking about the life and power meters the game has. One final image, which is the dumping setup Peter used. This is a rig he built with Morton back in the day, and is the way in which all the Gamate games supported in MAME have been dumped. The cartridges have a security check which must pass before they give out any data, and the dumping rig shown here performs the handshake required with the cartridge, amongst other things. It's quite a complex setup. So that was the additional media, now let's pick up the game where we left off. One of the first things you notice once you get in-game is that Mighty Boxer has not gone down the route of being a Punch-Out clone. This maybe surprised me most, as the developers were surely aware of Nintendo's success with the Punch-Out titles, and with the Game Boy itself lacking a Punch-Out game, it could have been the perfect way to push more sales of the Gamate. If you haven't seen a Gamate, it's a horizontally orientated device, and it has a very standard control setup. A directional pad, 2 action buttons, and then just out of comfortable thumb reach, the start and select buttons for operating the menus. For boxing games of this style, that usually means an attack button and a block button, and no surprise, that is the setup here, with the directional pad allowing you to move around the ring. The game requires you to be facing your opponent, so if you move horizontally past them, there's a brief pause while the characters are flipped around to face each other again. This can at first be jarring, as the characters don't simply flip, they also teleport back a few paces, putting you just out of arm's reach. Once you realise what is happening in such situations though, it makes sense. Like most boxing games, this is as much about conserving your energy as it is landing blows on your opponent. Timing and knowing when to strike is key. Each punch, regardless of if it hits, misses or is blocked, drains your power meter, which recharges over time, but stronger punches, such as uppercuts, can only be executed when the bar is above a certain point. As you will have seen from the manual, there are 6 boxes in the game, and the single player mode is simply a case of facing each of the other 5 boxes in best of 3 contests. Standard fighting game rules apply. You win by draining the life of your opponent down to 0, or by having the most life remaining when the timer runs out. There's no form of boxing scorecard here rating you on performance, it's strictly a case of winning or losing the fight. I'm assuming the difficulty ramps up as you progress through the 5 fights, but I could be wrong. It could simply be a test of endurance. I'm sure there's a winning strategy to the game, but I found it to be tough. I'm not the best player of boxing games anyway, as a lot of the gameplay involves trying to read what the computer opponent is going to do next, and using correctly timed blocks before launching counters, which requires a good level of dexterity. The game definitely wasn't letting me get away with simply mashing buttons. In order to test the game fully, I ended up making an infinite health cheat and found that the game does have a short end sequence and staff credits once you complete it. Visually, you can see that the graphics here are quite flickery, with obvious redraw, and movement isn't exactly smooth. This is what you come to expect from a Gamate game though, because unlike the Game Boy, the Gamate lacks any real sprite or tile map system. All graphics are rendered to bitmaps, with only a rudimentary auto-incrementing counter to help with the drawing. This lack of meaningful hardware acceleration means the CPU is doing all the work, and even when the display area is only 160 by 150 pixels, that's a lot of work for a 2MHz 6502 CPU. I'm sure there was room for improvement, but it was never realistically going to give Game Boy quality visuals, and the inherent persistence of the LCD screens means that when using original hardware, a lot of that flicker is lost to ghosting anyway. Audio design here is better than I was expecting. The Gamate uses an AY8910 for audio, which is a chip anybody who grew up with the 8-bit micros over here will be familiar with, and while the compositions may not rival those of Rob Hubbard, they do a good job of elevating the game into a more complete experience, with both in-game music and sound effects. There's even a dedicated tune for the pause screen, showing a greater level of work was put into developing this title when compared to many other lower budget productions. I would say, all things considered, that this makes good use of the AY8910. There are many arcade games with the same audio chip that do a lot less with it. I mentioned the pause screen, but that is just one example of where this game does more than it strictly needed to do. There is a level of flair with the presentation here that is unexpected. Nothing extreme, but having pre-fight scenes, and a track demo displaying the stats for each boxer, and a game over sequence complete with ambulance, and, as previously mentioned, an ending sequence, all go beyond expectations for what developers must have known a large number of people would have considered a throwaway game for a system that they got instead of the Game Boy that they really wanted. Credit where it's due. one feature of the game you won't be able to enjoy in emulation is the 2-player link feature. The Gamate had the option for a 2-player serial link cable, which is why that picture of 2 Gamates was featured on the manual. While almost no software made use of it, Mighty Boxer is one of the few that does. Quite ironic that it should be an advertised feature of this game, when the game is so rare that the chances of knowing anybody with a copy to play against must have been slim to zero even back then. It's a feature I'd quite like to add to the emulation, but my preference would be a MAME configuration that emulates 2 units at once, rather than having to fire up 2 instances of MAME and get them to awkwardly communicate. I'm not sure it would be officially accepted the way I'd prefer though. Maybe in the future a single copy of MAME will be able to instantate multiple machines at once though, as there's very little difference between a driver and a device anyway right now. The cartridge itself here was on its last legs. There were clear signs of the plastic degrading and turning into a sticky goo-like substance, and getting a dump of the ROM proved tricky for Peter too, even with the otherwise reliable tool he'd created with Morton all those years back, again possibly due to impending structural failure of the cartridge material leading to some lines on the ROM glob not making a good connection. Luckily he was able to get a number of consistent reads out of the device, with the repeatable read appearing to be a good dump and the others having clear problems such as data or address lines making a bad connection. Another couple of years and this could have been a very different story. Maybe more worrying here is that this didn't even appear to be a game that had been abused. The box and manual were in the best condition you could expect them to be in for a product of this age, with no signs that anything had been subject to any kind of extreme conditions. But when you're dealing with media from 32 years ago, that was produced as cheaply as possible at the time, these are some of the challenges we now face. If you have games for any similar systems that you have any reason at all to believe may differ from what can be found already, get them dumped. They will not last forever. It's easy to laugh at how bad some of the games featured in the earlier part of this video were, but at least future generations will be able to study the missteps and maybe even identify things they did get right too. Mighty Boxer now joins that list of games that can be studied, and we'll never really know how close this one was to being lost. It's difficult to form a full opinion of Mighty Boxer, but in the context of the Gamate library it looks like one of the higher effort attempts at creating an original piece of software for the system. While it's not going to go down as a genre-defining classic, in terms of depth it offers nothing more than a shallow arcade style of gameplay, but I think if you owned a Gamate back in the early 90s, you would have found this to be a perfectly enjoyable way of passing the time on a long journey. With that, I conclude my coverage of Mighty Boxer. I hope you've enjoyed the video. The game will be supported in MAME 0.256, which is out at the end of this month. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed, please hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.